So we are going to talk about BDS. I would say my most hated topic in this field. There are a lot of exciting and inspirational aspects that you've heard all morning about this field, but BDS is not one of them. But it's really important that we talk about it today because it's a problem not only for the Jewish community, who cares deeply about Israel, but it's a problem for anyone who cares about the integrity of the responsible investing and the responsible business movements that we address this. So I know many of you are familiar with BDS, but I'm going to do a little bit of explanation. BDS is a campaign of economic warfare against Israel through boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. And many of you are familiar with BDS on campus, but today we're going to zero in on the economic warfare side, the D, divestment. So BDS activists have been manipulating the responsible investing field for over a decade in a manner quite invisible to the Jewish community. First, they pressure institutional investors to adopt BDS in their responsible investing policies and to divest from companies with ties to Israel. And then they pressure large multinational corporations to cut or divest their ties to Israel, or they threaten to ruin their reputations. Unfortunately, in the past few years, BDS has succeeded in convincing large institutional investors in Europe and the United States to adopt BDS, and some multinational companies have cut ties to Israel as a result of constant pressure and controversy. For those of you that don't know, I also want to share the organized Jewish community's view, and that is the lens that we have today, is the broad-based community's lens. Their view that BDS is not about human rights, nor about peace. It is a political campaign fueled in large part by anti-Semitism, and it is the latest iteration in the efforts to delegitimize Israel and to deny the Jewish people self-determination. So we have an incredible panel today of real experts on this topic. I come at this from the responsible investing movement. Momo at the end comes at this from the responsible business movement. And then in the middle, we have some experts on Israel advocacy. So I'm going to turn to all of the panelists and ask that you introduce your organizations and how you became aware and knowledgeable on this, the economic warfare side.
Hi, I'm Ann Hertzberg. I'm the legal advisor at NGO Monitor. We are a Jerusalem-based research organization that looks at the funding and activities of non-governmental organizations active in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we've been tracking the BDS movement really since its inception at the 2001 UN Durban Conference. I started to notice BDS sort of entering the CSR, socially responsible investing sphere, about 8 or 9 years ago. Prior to that, I used to do a lot of research on lawsuits filed by BDS activists in Europe and in North America to try to use judicial mechanisms to get them to divest from Israel. And those efforts were largely unsuccessful. I'm not really aware of any lawsuit that's ever succeeded that's been brought by a BDS to target Israel. And because of that, the movement morphed, and it then started to look at other ways in which it could advance its agenda. And one of those was via the CSR sector. And a few things happened that kind of facilitated that effort. Number one was the burgeoning business and human rights movement within the United Nations frameworks. So you had the UN Guiding Principles were adopted in 2011. You had the creation of the Business and Human Rights Working Group and the Business and Human Rights Global Forum. Coupled with that, at the time, the Special Rapporteur for the Palestinians to the Human Rights Council was a very active BDS activist, like one of the leaders of BDS activism. And he really used his platform to advance, to sort of innovate, really. I mean, it was an innovation to try to co-opt the CSR movement and target Israel with it. And so what we saw is there were some proto-blacklists in his reports back in 2013, 2012, that really are the basis of the upcoming Human Rights Council blacklist, which I'll talk about a little bit later. There was a report on settlements that really started advocating boycotting Israel under those auspices. And in 2014, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights published a report examining looking at Israel through this business and human rights framework, it's the only report ever been put out by the High Commissioner's Office and the only country that's ever been targeted under this framework. And that really was the basis for what we are going to see in the blacklist coming up. The other area where they have really tried to gain a foothold is within the CSR movement itself. So you started to see in mostly Northern Europe several successful divestment campaigns. And when we started to drill down on those, what we saw was a lot of the research companies, the ESG research companies and the ethical committees that were advising on which companies to divest from, a lot of those people were BDS activists. So you have at the companies BDS activists, on the ethical councils you have BDS activists. So that was one thing. And then another thing is what we saw is, and I think this is because from what I've looked at, and it's something I'm studying right now, is there is no standardization in how the research companies really look at human rights and ESG. It's kind of chaotic. There's dozens of firms and committees in this field. And so what was happening would be, you would see in some of the ESG reports, one in particular I saw recommended sort of dinged a company, and the sole source was a campaign from BDS 48. That was the name of the source. So there was no looking into, it was solely relying on these BDS groups as the sole source of information. And so that's something else we've seen, and that's really starting to take off now. So I'll stop there and add a little more in the next question.
I just want to also, when you say CSR, corporate social responsibility,
yes.
That's also, I was referring to it as a responsible business movement. And then the UN blacklist, can you just explain what that?
Sure. So in March 2016, the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution. It was sponsored by the Arab League, calling for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to put out a list of companies that it claimed was doing business in the settlements. But when you actually look at their criteria, the definition of settlements is so broad, it covers security, a lot of functions that are specified under the Oslo Accords that Israel's mandated to do under the Oslo Accords. It's trying to list companies that are involved in that. Settlements could be the old city. So if you're involved in a construction project refurbishing a synagogue, like the Horva synagogue in the old city, you can be on this list. If you sell a Ben & Jerry's in the West Bank, you can be on this list. It's incredibly broad. There's no clear definitions of settlements. Settlements in their definition includes the light rail of Jerusalem and many other things. So that list was supposed to come out a year ago. I and some other folks wrote a submission, submitted it to the High Commissioner, and I'm happy to give a copy to anyone after the panel, that got the process delayed by a year. So the High Commissioner is supposed to be putting this list out it's supposed to be coming out around now, but it looks like it's going to be delayed until March. But no one really knows what form it's going to take at the moment because aside from the Arab League support and Russia and China, the usual suspects of the Human Rights Council, all of the European countries are against it. The US, obviously, Canada, Australia, have been lobbying vigorously against this. I think it's a total perversion of the business and human rights framework and really could end up destroying that initiative. So.
Hi, I'm Ethan Felsen, and thank you, Julie, for pulling this amazing gathering together and for the opportunity to work with you over so many years on this topic. I'm the co-executive director of the Israel Action Network, which is a project that mobilizes Jewish federations, Jewish community relations councils, and other friends of Israel to build a broad base of support for Israel, to support two states for two peoples, and to counter delegitimization of Israel. So we're working on BDS with a large staff team 24/6. I first became aware of BDS when I was at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, one of our sponsor agencies, we had staff down at the UN World Conference Against Racism, and it was there that we became aware of a group called the Sabeel Center for Palestinian Liberation Theology. It was a group that was very influential in this NGO conference. Those of you who don't remember Durban, it was a reviving the Zionism is racism language was a hot debate. We had a motion to say that anti-Semitism was a form of racism, and groups like Sabeel and the World Council of Churches were fighting us on that, and that's where they rolled out this BDS campaign, and it was really painful to see. I was the chair of the anti-apartheid group at my undergraduate school, and to see that those noble tools of boycott, divestment, and sanctions being used in this way that was theologically anti-Semitic, and from what we could see, really disassociated from truth-telling, was a very, very painful thing, and we kind of looked away because the week after Durban was 9/11. And then in 2004, the Presbyterian Church passed a resolution beginning a pathway toward divestment, and we got involved with all of the churches asking what was going on, and every single one of them was ready to move with divestment. Groups associated with Sabeel had taken over, literally taken over, were the majority in every Middle East peace and justice committee that operated within these churches, and the Presbyterians were the obvious first place to go because we said socially responsible investment, it's a noble pursuit. In the Presbyterian Church, unlike the others, the job is handed over to a committee, and that committee gets to buy $3,000 worth of shares in various companies so they can do the engagement. They don't have a fiduciary duty to investors, to the pension, and it was activists who made up the committee. And so the thing that we kept on seeing, I'm the poor guy who goes to these conventions, which go for like 7 or 8 days, and unlike this, they don't serve food. And they all start on time. It's very disconcerting for me. But we would see the BDS groups telling stories that we knew weren't true. Caterpillar was the first one up. Caterpillar doesn't sell to Israel. They don't weaponize equipment. They don't armor equipment. They don't maintain the equipment. But the people in the churches were being told this so that they could build up this narrative because, first of all, the mendacity of it, the integrity, you used the word integrity. Integrity could be checked at the door. So at the Israel Action Network, we spent a lot of time dealing with academic associations, with the churches. Our theory of action is to work with the right messengers, people who are within these communities, mostly progressive communities, to help them shape the right messages and to give them the infrastructure to do the work to counter delegitimization.
Hello, my name is Itai Nixon. I'm the Director of Economic Affairs for the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Public Diplomacy in Israel. So I won't talk about myself personally, I'll talk about the ministry. So obviously Israel's has known about the BDS campaign or delegitimization for quite a while. The government basically changed gears somewhere around 2015 and decided that there needs to be a more concerted effort by the government in order to counter BDS and delegitimization. And then our ministry was tasked with coordinating all the government's efforts, the various different ministries, in order to achieve the goal. And the goal is to defend Israel. That's my goal, or the ministry's goal. Now, first of all, let me just say that BDS is the current manifestation of delegitimization. It's not the whole story. It's a much more ancient anti-Israel bias or even anti-Semitism, as you've said here before. And there's been many forces throughout the years trying to delegitimize Israel. It used to be more through war and guerrilla warfare or terrorism, unilateral moves in the UN and other institutions. And currently it's BDS, but it will morph, and I think we're seeing it morph now, actually. They're sort of dropping the BDS brand in many cases because they see that brand is sort of failing. So I'll start off by saying that BDS in the economic arena, and I think in many other arenas, has failed so far. If you look at the broad perspective, Israel's economy is doing very well. And the last year we grew, in 2016, there was a 4% growth rate. Our GDP growth rate projection has been increased recently. Labor market indicators have never been better. We're considered what's full employment, so about 4.2% unemployment. FDI, or foreign direct investment, since the founding of BDS in 2005 until today is, I think, gone times 3.5. Well, the average OECD is about 1.5 or 2. There's a lot of statistics that can show that they've failed when you look at the macro level of Israel. However, this must be said, I have a friend from other ministries who say, you always look at the macro level, you always look at Israel's total economy. But for a company that suffers from BDS, that's the whole story. It doesn't really matter what happened to the whole economy. The whole economy can be growing and be doing great. But for the one company, that's what they have to deal with now, and they're suffering. So that's a perspective that we always try and take into account as well. But I'll just go back and say, our economy is doing very well. 2017 was not a good year for BDS. I must say, when I came into the ministry about a year ago, there was a lot of talk about 2017 is going to be a tough year because it's 100 years since Balfour and 70 years since the state, and a bunch of numbers. And but it hasn't been successful for them. They've failed on a lot of fronts. So why do we need to worry about economic BDS? First of all, because it is a threat. We identify it as a threat. We know that we're vulnerable over there. They can't attack us militarily, but they believe that they can attack us economically, and they can lead to divestment. They can lead the multinational companies to leave Israel, and we have to prepare for that. And second of all, from a purely economical standpoint, I'm an economist by training. A company's decision-making process should be based on economic indicators. It could be social impact, it could be various economic indicators, but it should not be motivated by this kind of political warfare. And that's something that's very important personally to me. And yeah, basically that's for the time being.
Hi, I'm Momo Madav. I'm the CEO of Ma'ala, which is we're basically a corporate network for corporate social responsibility in Israel. We're working with about 120 of Israel's largest businesses, both Israeli and US or other Europeans working in Israel. And maybe I'll start with linking, I think, this panel to what we've discussed this morning. In my eyes, corporate social responsibility or sustainability, both words are practically the same, is another or is the source of, I would say, of the whole impact investment kind of issue. Because to take a story that I remember is the one of Unilever, the Dutch, Anglo-Dutch consumer goods company. Their story is that when we started, and that was, I think, 100 and some years ago, they were one of the main, I would say, agents that fought problems of diseases that were caused by lack of hygiene. And as a business entity, they had the strongest motive to promote soap and to encourage people to watch over their hygiene, and therefore reducing the percentage of people, and flakes and stuff like that. So if we move forward, and we saw all those wonderful examples of new impact investment ideas, and we connect that to what the BDS is trying to do, it's the same thing. It's people with, with values and with emotions. Some of them are somewhat negative, I would say, but definitely some of them do feel that they operate in light of some values. They implement those soft kind of considerations, not necessarily the pure economic ones, and say what Israeli companies are doing is violating human rights and other considerations. And to jump to where we are now, as a corporate network and as a kind of a social change agent, the thing that I feared when we started to receive those calls from companies saying we have those appeals from investors is that we'll put a lot of work, and at best, at the end, we'll come back to where we started. Because that's basically, you simply need to find kind of a negative wave that comes your way, and at the end, you're staying hopefully at the same spot. So what we did instead, and it took us some years, obviously, to reach there, is to actually try and to turn the lemon to a lemonade, so to speak, to try to use that interest in Israel, in the Israeli market, on behalf of investors, not of those of the activists. With them, I don't think we can do anything. But with the investors who tend to kind of get all those reports and claims from the BDS, and are interested in what goes on in the Israeli market, and in some cases their interest is somewhat negative, is actually to use that in order to present the Israeli market all the things that it can offer in terms of sustainability and good ESG investments. And we basically started, and that's what we did last week, and I'll end here, we started to do an international conference in Israel with one of the major target audiences is actually all those ESG investors, mainly from Scandinavian countries in Europe, but also from the States, and maybe if we'll have some time, I'll speak more of that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I love that Momo turns BDS into lemonade, which only we could do that.
It's an approach in life, otherwise,
Yeah, and really, and Momo and I have talked about this, really also a little bit for JLens as well. We don't say quite that expression, but we call BDS a window. We didn't start JLens to fight BDS, but it has very much been something that the Jewish community increasingly has been focused on, and has created a window onto these movements that we haven't been as engaged as we should be. The way we found out about BDS and really started to become quite expert, unfortunately, at it, was that a couple years ago we were asked by a few of the Jewish institutional investors that were moving into the field that they didn't want to invest in any funds that supported BDS. And so we didn't think that that would be a problem, and we called a number of responsible investing firms and funds and said, we're working with institutional investors, what's your Israel policy? And we got a barrage of BDS answers, anywhere from we don't invest in Israel to we are neutral, we're indifferent if Israel exists. That was neutral. And so we were horrified, all under our nose really, in this field that we were not aware of. And that the fact that there had become, over a decade of work, quietly in corners that we weren't part of the conversation, that there had been this anti-Israel normalization into the field, into the research, into the proxy voting policies, into rankings of companies. Anytime there's a controversy by BDS, a company loses its score. All of the tactics that we love really were being weaponized against Israel. So I wanted to ask all of you, because the movement does morph, they're pretty sophisticated. So I wanted to ask where you see it going next, kind of a BDS 2.0, and then we'll open it up for a couple questions.
So I think this upcoming blacklist, I think, is one thing the BDS movement's really pinning its hopes on, because of what Julie's been saying, how they kind of operate under the radar, and how they are sort of co-opting the ESG research frameworks.
ESG is environmental, social,
and governance. So I think they're pinning their hopes on the Human Rights Council blacklist because even though it's not legally binding, it has no effect in and of itself. But I think what they're going to try to do is use this list so that, when an ESG company or one of the ethical councils in Norway or Sweden, or even government officials, where we've seen this also take place in Europe in particular, will simply refer to the list, and that will be the only criteria in which they will, give a company a bad ranking or advise an institutional investor not to invest in that company, or to do any kind of government contracts with that company. So I think that's one thing that they're pinning their hopes on, and because when you look at the research companies, if there are any representatives from a research company here, I would love to speak with you because it's something I'm trying to map out now and look at. in some cases, it just seems when they look at a company, at least when it comes to Israel, they may just find one source, regardless of how fringe it may be, not looking into the claims, and then just automatically use that as a basis without consulting the company or trying to, look at alternative source material to try to clarify what the issue is, if there is an issue. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, I think, with all the legislation that's been being passed now in the state by the states, anti-BDS legislation, and also in the federal government, I think one thing they've been trying to do now is launch legal attacks on that type of legislation, which really is just a continuation of the anti-Arab boycott legislation. It's been in place since the 70s. It's always withheld challenges in court, but they are looking to do that now. And related to that is a worrying trend that I've been seeing where several sort of mainstream U.S. organizations have now really professional BDS activists amongst their ranks. So I could name those groups. I don't know if I want to do it here at the moment. I could. But when you start to look at now who's working at some of these organizations, I feel it is a concerning trend where they are trying to use these groups to try to get legitimacy for their activism.
Yes, investment screens. They're innocuous. Mm-hmm. All of the progressive organizations that have big pots of money, the churches certainly, universities as well, take a look at their corpus and say we're not going to be invested in companies that are responsible for environmental degradation or discrimination against gay and lesbian people. And the idea, we've seen it happen in a couple of audiences where they say, hey, you and I, we have worked in this church our entire lives. We have a pension. We don't profit from discrimination against LGBTQ people. We don't profit from harming the environment, and we shouldn't profit from companies that are responsible for the suffering of innocent Israelis or Palestinians. It's innocuous language that they work in, and then later on, the people who you're describing who are sitting in the relevant committees ensure that it's implemented in a way that harms Israel. And I want to pick up a bit on what you said in terms of the United Nations list. The way that gets used is then you simply pass a resolution that says we won't invest in any company that is on a watch list produced by the United Nations Human Rights Council, and that's why there's such apoplexy about the federal legislation. As you noted, for 40 years, we've had legislation in this country that says that it is criminal to help the Arab League boycott. Right? An individual can boycott whomever they want. An individual can boycott Israel, but there's this boycott called for by foreign nations, and the U.S. law says that if a boycott is called for by foreign nations, you can't provide information to it, and there are criminal sanctions for that. Those have been U.S. law for 40 years, and there is legislation that would say, in addition to boycotts called by foreign nations, also boycotts called by intergovernmental organizations, so it would apply to the United Nations or the European Union. And all of a sudden, we're hearing they want to enshrine in law criminal sanctions. They want to criminalize the providing of information. That's been settled law for 40 years. It's why this legislation is such an important thing. We have to recognize they've got a long game. They have a very long game. And the idea isn't necessarily about the 150 companies that make the list. It's about the next 3, 4, 5, 6,000 companies that are looking for a market to go into, and it's this country, this company, this country, or this country, but if I go into Israel, I'm going to face all of this pressure, and we won't even know about it. That's why it's so important to be involved in these institutions, making sure everybody here knows somebody who is influential in a university, in a church, and we need to have conversations with them so that we can open up their eyes to the realities of what is being done here.
All right. So I think I completely agree with both of you. I think the main change that we saw, and this is a longer arch, not necessarily the last year or two, is the movement from the boycott to the divest. That used to be anything related to Israel boycott, and then they became a bit more sophisticated and they said, okay, well, we'll choose specific targets to boycott. And now they're basically moving from boycott to divestment. And that shows they're evolving. I think it also shows that it's a much more nuanced claim. It's less violent. BDS, like I said before, is perceived as in many places, including Europe, where they've been traditionally more successful, is being perceived as very, very violent. So they've kind of gone over to hijack these moral and ethical principles. They've been doing that for a while. They've been laying the groundwork for a long time. And that's what they're focusing on right now. I mean, their basic claim is anything happening in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, beyond the Green Line, call it whatever you want, is a violation of human rights. So a company can't operate there without violating human rights. Therefore, you must divest from them. First of all, that doesn't follow from the UN guiding principles, and Momo can probably explain that way better than I can, but a company is allowed to operate in a risk zone. You need to judge a company by its actions and not by where it's acting, because if you pull every company out of a conflict area, a occupied territory, a risk zone, again, call it whatever you want, you're going to be creating bigger damage. You're going to be creating more hardship instead of promoting anything beneficial. And that's why when we see this, when you see this focus on Israel, it is very anti-Israel and very, I guess, anti-Semitic. Again, BDS understand that there's no difference between attacking Israel proper or attacking companies that operate in those areas, because Israel doesn't have two separate economies. It's not two separate ecosystems. It's one large economy. So if you damage one company in one area, you're going to be damaging other companies. That's why the targets that they're picking for divestment are traditionally large companies or companies that facilitate all of Israel's economy. So the banking industry is being targeted. And obviously the banking industry provides services for settlements as well as to the rest of Israel. Now, it's important also to say that this isn't like a classic grassroots organization trying to promote, a corporation to act in a more ethical manner. Corporations that tried to engage with BDS are the ones that suffered most, because there's no appeasing the other side. The goal is not to improve your corporate behavior. The goal is for Israel not to exist anymore. So they're using various methods. And yeah, I agree with you. They're going over to international institutions to try and promote this. And yeah, the legislation piece is obviously very important. It's not something the government of Israel is promoting, but yeah. Sorry.
So I would, I'm kind of not necessarily following directly how the BDS kind of evolves. What I could add to the discussion is that, firstly, most Israeli businesses do not really want to deal with the BDS, and if you're Israeli, in most cases, you can get away with it rather nicely. The problem starts when you are looking for international investors, and it's even more of a problem if you're a multinational working in Israel. And those are the most difficult cases. And I think in those cases, the BDS has some successes, because the stakeholders in the States or in Europe are much more prone to listen to arguments claiming that the operation in Israel violates human rights. I think, again, in terms of what we can do about those things, and I think there was some, I absolutely agree with what was said before. The first point is, again, try to get the analysts and the raters to look more carefully, to understand better the Israeli market, to look more carefully into the facts. And as Itai somewhat mentioned, there are some criteria of working in risk-related zones. Some of the work that's been going on in Israel is actually under those suggested rules. It's not a rule, it's a voluntary regulation. And what the BDS tries to do is to kind of blur, I would say, the borders between what is actually being done and what is the kind of the bigger picture. And if you get if you get into a conversation with the raters, with the investors, and you make a discussion around facts, I think you can, in some cases, fight all those claims. The second thing is to invest in Israel. And I think that it's very simple. I mean, if you do create a trend of being interested in investing in Israel, and obviously do that with SRI, ESG criteria, definitely that's another good answer to that, I think.
Great, thank you all. I would say from our perspective at JLens, so we are very clear that we are opposed to this movement, but we're also deeply engaged in the responsible and the impact investing movement. And just by kind of hanging that shingle a couple years ago, we have had so many conversations with the middle. Right, we're never going to win over kind of the loud activists at the extreme, but we have had so many people who have said to us, why is Israel so focused upon more than any other country? Why are there more shareholder resolutions on Israel this year than all other countries combined? Why is this? I get the question all the time. Why is Israel even in? I know in this room, obviously the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so paramount and something we all want to see resolved, but a lot of people ask, there's so much going on in the world. Why is Israel getting so much attention in this field? So people really don't understand what is driving it and breaking all of this down. We have time for maybe one or two questions. We're almost over, but might as well, yeah.
Hi. First of all, kol hakavod for having this panel and for the contribution you're all making. You asked about data providers. What I wanted to share is the last point I think Momo just made about investing in Israel. In addition to all the things we're doing on a defensive, the idea of combating divestment with investment, which I know JLens has been an advocate for, is something very simple that we can all do. One other piece of data that I'm very happy to share with you is just as the enemies of Israel are creating lists of companies that are supposedly doing bad things in Israel, the greatest companies in the world are investing in Israel. Apple, Google, Intel, Nestle. So this same community on the idea of defending, we should also invest in the companies that invest in Israel. Israeli companies and the foreign companies, the same ones that people are trying to get to divest.
And question?
And the question is, what are we going to do about it?
Any other questions?
I
can actually, what I suggest.
Nope,
okay,
we're
later.
gonna take it.
Okay, sorry.
I guess it comes right on the heels of that, but as a Zionist, socially responsible investor who wants to invest in Israeli companies, how can I get transparency into which companies are profiting directly from the occupation, what percentage of operations are going on in the settlements, and on the flip side, which companies are positively, through their actions, leading us to this two states or two people solution that we all seem to agree on? You know, Matled doesn't really rank these things. How can we get that? How can we get that transparency so that we can do that responsible investment in Israel?
Anyone else? I will. Thank you, Stephen, for your comment and question. I actually will. I just wanted to share one thing that we're running out of time, but we're going to touch on later today in a really jam-packed session on multi-faith in the UN, SDGs, and peace building. But that we do a lot of work at JLens around impact investing in peace building. It's a theme that we've been focused on for a number of years, starting with Rwanda, and so it's perfect for not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the idea that divestment is a very negative, unsophisticated term that's really not used in the field anymore when you can actually have positive impact on the ground where you're trying to move the needle on an issue. And so in a conflict area in particular around the world, when you are investing and creating jobs and creating resilience and creating opportunities, and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, investing in the Palestinian economy, that's what impact investors do. That's what impact investing is about. So that's strategic. BDS hates that tactic, but that's the strategic tactic if you care about the conflict. Any other quick responses?
I just want to say to the last question, the term profiting from the occupation was raised. And first of all, I'd like to say that I don't think there's a company that operates in Israel that in some way isn't involved in some way in the occupation. I think what Julie brought up now is a very good point. You should look at companies according to what they do. So the light rail project in Jerusalem that goes from East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem, according to the delegitimizers is unethical because it goes in East Jerusalem. But if you actually go on the ground and look at the project, it's a phenomenal project. It connects to two sides of the cities, and it doesn't matter what kind of solution you'll eventually have. It's a beneficial project to everybody, to people living in East Jerusalem, to people living in West Jerusalem, so that the question about profiteering from the occupation, again, is not appropriate. You need to examine each company according to how it's behaving and according to the impact.
So let me
Okay.
if I just,
Okay,
sorry.
The Palestinians in the Dayton Accords asked for the Israelis to use a system where they could have a thumbprint reader so that Palestinians who are working in Israel could go through a checkpoint without having to deal with an Israeli soldier. The BDS movement then took that, the fact that the equipment was developed by Hewlett-Packard and the Israelis use it, to say that Hewlett-Packard makes the degrading and demoralizing biometric scanners that Israel uses at the checkpoints to institutionalize the occupation and control the movement of Palestinians. I guess the good side. So I would say be careful about the language that you hear that's used. This was something the Palestinians wanted. They've been calling for HP-free churches. Now, HP is split into 15 different companies, and the ones that developed that is probably nothing to do with the HP that people are invested in. But they just announced that after a year, they have 21 HP-free churches. There are 300,000 churches in America.
2 quick points, and I'll be happy to continue the discussion. First of all, don't bring businesses into politics. Businesses cannot replace the government and the vote of the people. I may not agree with some things, but businesses cannot replace that. And our message is professionalize, not politicize the business sector. Second point is that Ma'ala runs an index on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, which is doing rather well, by the way. And it's a tool to see companies who are committed to ESG and transparency. Maybe not to all the desires that are in this room, but definitely to a large extent of that. And let's continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for moderating. Thank you, panelists.